Hello, in today's video, we're going to be taking care of this outer tie rod on this 2005 Chevy Colorado, which is more than likely causing our steering wheel shake and vibrations at higher speeds. And as you can see, this thing has a lot of play in it, which is definitely a problem. Well, without further ado, let's get started with our removal and replacement of this outer tie rod. The first thing we'll do is loosen the lug nuts using a 19mm socket, and we'll just want to break them loose about 1/4 of a turn. Followed up by lifting it and supporting it with a jack stand. And with that done, we can go ahead and completely remove the wheel. Well, here we got our outer tie rod. The first thing we want to do is loosen the jam nut behind the tie rod. And for this, we're going to use a 7/8 wrench. This nut is normally really tight on this particular truck, so you'll want to be prepared. Well, let's go ahead and give it a try. But unfortunately, this doesn't seem to be working. Time to try some WD-40, spraying at the separation, so hopefully it soaks in and helps us out. And may as well spray the tie rod to spindle threads while I'm at it. And lastly, making sure to spray some on the threads behind the jam nut. Now we let that soak in for a good 15 to 20 minutes. Well, let's go ahead and give it another try. And there it goes. Let's loosen it and bring it up against the tie rod, doing that a few times so it frees it up. And then finally, hand tighten it against the tie rod, and this will hold the alignment where we need it. Next, we'll loosen the tie rod to spindle nut using the 21mm socket, plus an extension. Rotating it counterclockwise to remove it. This nut will be tight the whole way through, being that it's a lock nut, but after a few turns, you're going to want to check it to make sure the nut is coming out and not just spinning with the assembly. But in this case, it's coming out fine, so we'll just keep going. Once it's almost out, let's go ahead and remove the nut. Now to separate the tie rod from the spindle, I'll be using a pickle fork to do so. This tool works by placing it between the spindle and the tie rod, then using a hefty hammer, we're going to want to hit the end of the pickle fork, driving it inward, and the wedge should and will eventually separate the two. Although this one's being really stubborn. There it goes, finally. And it should now just come out. If not, just tap it lightly the rest of the way. To completely remove the outer tie rod, we'll need to rotate it off. Although this one's on here pretty tight, so to hold the inner tie rod, we'll use a 13mm wrench. To spin off the outer tie rod, I'll use this 13/16 wrench, and we'll rotate the tie rod off counterclockwise. But as you do this, you're going to want to make sure to count the rotations, so starting at the top, there's 1, 2, and so on. For a total of 15 turns. And with that, the tie rod is off. Listen to the play on this old one. Over time, this play can cause it to snap off, so you don't want to leave it with one this bad for so long. There are 2 different outer tie rods for this vehicle, and based on the information from Moog, this number is for VIN numbers that have the last 8 digits below 68272519. So any VIN numbers higher than that, we'll use the other part number ES800643, being that they use the later version. And this replacement will include our outer tie rod, the nut, the cotter pin, and the grease fitting. But before we install it, let's get the zerk fitting, otherwise known as a grease fitting, on. Threading it on by hand first, then use a 7mm socket to tighten it. Comparing our new one to the old one, making sure that it's the same length, which our new one seems a tad shorter, but maybe it's just the housing. But it is supposed to be the right one, so I guess we'll see. Now to install it back on the truck, at this point as we rotate it back on, we want to count the turns. So we should get 15 rotations back in. 1, 2, and there's 15. And it only goes halfway more, so we're good. Let's now get it into the spindle, pushing the end so it angles in, and we can also rotate the spindle over onto the tie rod if we have to. Once we get it in, we can thread on the castle nut till it tightens by hand. Now to tighten and torque the nut to spec, for the original style nut, the torque is 33 foot-pounds plus 85 to 95 degrees, but being that this one is a castle nut, I do 45 foot-pounds, and then you'll want to get the castle nut opening to line up with the hole so you can get the cotter pin through. Tighten it little by little till it lines up to the next opening, but you do not want to back off the nut. Instead, if you go too far, you'll want to restart, torque it, then tighten it till it lines up. Now we install the cotter pin, bending the end so it locks in the cotter pin and locks the nut. Finally, we tighten the jam nut to 55 foot-pounds, but you can't really torque it, so just give it a good tightening. Now to grease the tie rod. For this we'll use a grease gun, placing the end of the hose onto the zerk fitting and pump it a few times. As you pump it, you should notice that the boot begins to inflate with grease, and that's when we'll want to stop. If you do it too much, like this for example, the grease will begin to come out of the boot, and we don't want that. All that's left now is to install the wheel, install the lug nuts by hand, and snug them down in a crisscross pattern. Then finally, torque them down to 100 foot-pounds of torque. And even though we got the alignment as close as it was, it's always best to get an alignment afterwards, so you don't ruin your tires. But with that, we complete this video. I hope you found it helpful or informative. If so, please click that thumbs up button to support my video and my channel. And please subscribe if you haven't done so.